Good day everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's online tasting session. I'm Dr. Bill Lumsden. I'm Director of Distilling, Whisky Creation and Whisky Stocks for the Glenmorangie Company, and I have the pleasure of speaking to you today from my sensory laboratory right here in Scotland. Before we start the tasting session, one or two housekeeping rules. Now, firstly, I hope you've had the opportunity to download the tasting mat and the booklet for today's session. During the session, we're going to be tasting 4 delicious Glenmorangie whiskies. We'll start off with Glenmorangie Original, our flagship expression. We will follow this with X by Glenmorangie, a new release which we've developed specifically for mixing. Next in the lineup, we'll have Glenmorangie Quinta Ruban 14-year-old. And then finally, we will taste the star of today's show, the new release Glenmorangie Barrel Select 13-year-old cognac finish. If you have any questions throughout this session, I would encourage you to use the comments section on YouTube, and we'll try and answer them throughout the session. But just before we start, please join me in taking your glass of Glenmorangie Original. And while I introduce you to the Glenmorangie brand and the distillery, just take your time to inhale the bouquet, maybe even have a little sip of it. Now, of course, please keep enough in your glass for the full detailed tasting session. And of course, always enjoy responsibly. The Glenmorangie distillery itself is situated on the shores of the beautiful Dornoch Firth in the Northern Highlands of Scotland. And in this fantastic location, we've been distilling our whisky for more than 175 years. Throughout all of the history of the Glenmorangie distillery, we've always tried to do things a little bit differently, maybe think about things in a different way. And there's a number of key factors that lead to the delicious flavours in our range of whiskies. First of these is our unique water source. We draw our water from our own private spring, which is called the Tarlogie Spring. This is very unusual water for Scotland because it's what we call hard water, very rich in dissolved mineral salts. And I passionately believe this contributes to the complex flavour of our spirit. We source our barley locally wherever possible, and in the Northern Highlands of Scotland, we grow some of the finest quality malting barley in the world. Our still house is like a magnificent cathedral, and in fact, we have the tallest copper pot stills of any malt whisky distillery in Scotland. And these very, very tall necks, which are almost the same height as the neck of an adult male giraffe, give us a very refined, very delicate, very floral and very complex spirit. And this is one of the reasons why Glenmorangie has such a colourful, intriguing taste profile. The barrels we use are only the very finest, and I've worked with my partners throughout the world, but especially in the United States of America, to develop the perfect combination of characteristics to make our barrels ideal for a long, slow maturation of Glenmorangie. So I primarily use American oak for our maturation, and this gives lovely, soft, creamy texture and nice, sweet, buttery flavours to our whisky. The final part of this list of ingredients is imagination. And in the Glenmorangie Company, we've always had this inquisitive thought process. We've always thought, what if? We've tried not to let ourselves be too bound by convention. And this imagination has helped myself and my team develop a huge range of new expressions with fantastic, colourful, different, but always delicious flavours. So that leads me nicely into the first whisky we're going to taste today, our flagship expression Glenmorangie Original. Now, I could literally wax lyrical about this whisky for hours on end because this is a very, very personal whisky to me. And as some of you may know, this was actually the very first whisky that started it all off for me many years ago, back in my student days in 1984. This was the very first single malt Scotch that I ever tasted, and I can still vividly remember that first magical taste of it. And, I was so intrigued by the delicious taste profile of this that there and then I pretty much decided that my destiny lay in working in the Scotch whisky industry. So here I am many years later, ladies and gents, actually talking to you about this expression. Now, in the 27 years I've been with the Glenmorangie company, I've tweaked the flavour of this a little bit, but really I haven't changed it that much at all. And every time we bottle a batch of this, I'm trying to recreate my memory of that first magical sip of Glenmorangie Original. So the spirit is 100% matured in American oak ex-bourbon barrels for a minimum of 10 years. And we actually source these barrels ourselves to a very, very exacting and very unique specification. Now, we only use the barrels 2 times, which is quite unusual for the Scotch whisky industry. And this ensures that we maximise in maintaining the lovely soft texture of this whisky. So if you'd like to join me in just gently swirling your glasses and start to inhale the bouquet. You'll find all sorts of things on there. This is a very complex, very colourful whisky. And initially for me, I get lots of lovely perfumed floral notes, maybe a little bit of geranium, a little bit of carnation, perhaps even a little bit of sweet rose petal in there. Now, I always like to encourage a little bit more of the bouquet to come out of the glass. So I'm just going to add a few drops of water. I'm going to mix it through. And oh yeah, this is really encouraging the vapours to come out of the glass. So we call this in the Scotch whisky industry releasing the serpent, because the bouquet rises up out the glass like a snake or serpent. And it's a great way to really open up and explore all of the intricacies in the bouquet of a single malt Scotch whisky. So now that I've done that, I'm getting a little bit more of these nice fresh fruity notes in there. Maybe a little bit pear, a little bit apple, maybe even a little bit stone fruit like apricot or peach. So it's now time to take a sip and enjoy this. And if you sip it, ladies and gents, I now hope you see what I mean about this beautiful, soft, silky, almost creamy, buttery texture. And this is absolutely because of the quality of the barrels we use for Glenmorangie. Once that goes down, you'll start to get some of these primary flavours, and there's a little bit of a juxtaposition here. So there's some tart, bittersweet citrus flavours like lemon or mandarin orange. And then at the same time, there's a nice sweetness in there that will remind you of vanilla or almond or coconut. But there really is a lot going on in the glass here. It's a very colourful, complex whisky. And of course, this makes it ideal for pairing with many different types of food. And my strong recommendation here is to pair it with freshly caught, seared sea scallops. It pairs beautifully with that. I sometimes like it paired with just some simple fruits, but also some nice soft cheeses like a mild cheddar or a brie or something like that. Of course, I don't always just drink my original like this, neat and with a little bit water in it. I do occasionally enjoy it on the rocks, and I occasionally enjoy it in a cocktail. And my recommendation for a cocktail to use original with is the orange highball. And this beautifully accentuates the orange flavours in Glenmorangie Original. So that is whisky number 1, Glenmorangie Original. So we are now going to taste the recently introduced X by Glenmorangie for the second whisky in today's tasting session. Now, my inspiration for this whiskey came from the burgeoning mixology and cocktail scene which has been going on fire for the last 10 years or so. And it's something that has always greatly intrigued me because I've always passionately believed that malt whiskey is a great base for a cocktail, not least because you can still taste some of the nuances of flavour from your whiskey that you use. So we've launched this and we say that X by Glenmorangie is made for mixing. And yes, of course it is. But I can assure you, you can also enjoy this whiskey neat. And that's what we're going to do. So please join me in raising your glass of X by Glenmorangie. Now, given that I thought a lot of people would probably be using this as a base of cocktails, I wanted to up the flavour profile of this a little bit and particularly accentuate some deeper, bolder, spicier flavours. So along with the classic Glenmorangie X bourbon barrels, I've also matured some of the whiskies in this recipe in virgin charred oak, and that's where the deeper colour and some of the bold, spicy flavours and aromas come from. So at full strength, to me, on the bouquet, I get lots of nice dark chocolate, maybe even chocolate-coated ginger or chocolate-coated orange. And the spices are many in there, but in particular to me, a bit of ginger, a bit of clove, a bit of cinnamon. So I've just added a few splashes of water again. Oh yeah, and it's bringing out some of these lovely, fresh, bold, oaky flavours. Imagine walking into a carpenter's workshop where someone is patiently planing some new oak wood. That's what this is starting to make me think of in here. So time to take a sip. Now this is a bit richer, a bit more viscous in the mouth. It's a narrower spectrum of flavour, but they're bolder and more intense. So along with the lovely, the vanilla and coconut flavours, there's lovely spices in there. There's some new oak wood in there, a nice balsamic note, but in particular to me, it's this lovely chocolate ginger flavour in there. So if I am drinking my X by Glenmorangie, I will almost always have it in a large tumbler with one large rock of ice in it. And I think it works beautifully like that. Now, of course, we have introduced X by Glenmorangie as being particularly suitable for mixology. So with that in mind, I have a number of specially developed cocktails which you can find in our website, which I'd like to introduce to you. The first of these, the X Grapefruit Swizzle, is truly delicious. And to make this, you simply fill a glass with crushed ice, add a measure of X by Glenmorangie, add some grapefruit juice, a little bit maple syrup, then top up with club soda, mix it through and add a wedge of grapefruit to garnish. That's truly delicious and refreshing. For number 2, we have the X Cranberry Swizzle, which of course is particularly relevant for this time of year, the Thanksgiving season. So for this, take a highball glass, fill it with crushed ice, add a measure of X by Glenmorangie, some cranberry juice, and then finally some agave syrup. Once again, a truly delicious long drink. And for number 3, we have the X Barbecue Swizzle. So for this, again, fill your glass with crushed ice, add your measure of X by Glenmorangie, and this time top it up with ginger beer. Then take 3 large wedges of lime, squeeze the lime juice into your drink, mix it through, and use the lime wedges to garnish it. Oh yes, I like this one. And the lovely spiciness in the cocktail beautifully complements the spicy notes in the X by Glenmorangie. So this is perfect to drink with friends and family. So we're now going to taste whiskey number 3, which is the Glenmorangie 14-year-old Quinta Ruban, which is finished in port casks. Now, the story of this product goes back to kind of the mid-1990s when I particularly started experimenting with different types of wine cask to finish Glenmorangie whiskies in. And there have been various incarnations of this whiskey over the years. But for this particular expression, the 14-year-old, we launched this very recently, 3 to 4 years ago. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is the beautiful colour here. And this comes naturally from the inside of the ruby port pipes I use for this. So I use these enormous casks called pipes from Oporto in Portugal. And the base whiskey is matured in American oak bourbon barrels for round about 11.5 to 12 years. And I'm being deliberately vague here because it does vary a little bit. And then I transfer that mature whiskey into these port pipes. And for the final 2 to 2.5 years, the whiskey leaches the residue of the port wine into the whiskey, and it gives this incredible colour. Now, the name Quinta Ruban has an interesting origin as well. So the first word Quinta, Quinta, is of course the name generally given to a wine estate in Portugal. So just like in France, it's called a chateau, in Spain, a bodega, in Portugal, a quinta. And of course, the second word harks back to our traditional Scottish Gaelic roots. So the word Ruban is a Scottish Gaelic word meaning ruby or pink. And that's where the beautiful pale blush pink colour comes from. I've bottled this at a slightly higher strength. This is 46% alcohol by volume. And that's because I've left the whiskey in its natural non-chill filtered form, because I wanted to maximise the gourmand nature of this and accentuate the texture. But to start off with at full strength, yeah, there's no question, this is a much deeper, slightly more savoury whiskey, and I get notes that make me think of sandalwood or incense in there. I get a little bit of dark chocolate or plums in there, and there's a bit of menthol or mint or eucalyptus on the top note. But once again, I'm going to encourage a little bit more out of the glass. And now that I've done that, I get even more of that herbal top note. So it's sometimes like mint or menthol or eucalyptus, and sometimes even like a famous perfume fragrance, vetiver root. So I get that nice and herbal in there. Okay, let's try a sip now. The texture is really very different in this. It's ever so slightly drier on the palate, and I would describe it as being velvety. So if you can imagine the sensation of stroking a bit of velvet cloth, that's what this makes me think of. And it makes it ideal for pairing with certain foods. The flavour spectrum is much bolder and more intense than the first two whiskies, and I'm getting lovely flavour of dark chocolate in there, a little bit of black pepper, a hint of plum, this beautiful mentholic top note, and there's some nice tangy caramelised citrus fruit in there that makes me think of breakfast marmalade. And then finally, in the long aftertaste, you get a little bit more classic Glenmorangie, just a touch of vanilla, maybe a little bit of gentle nutty oak in there. Now, this whiskey is particularly good to be paired with savoury foods. And my favourite recommendations are to pair it with game. So something like venison or hare. And it works particularly well with venison, because if you cook the loin of venison properly, it has this lovely velvety texture, which mimics the texture of the Quinta Ruban whiskey. And if you can serve it with a bitter chocolate sauce, that just pairs so beautifully with Glenmorangie Quinta Ruban. So there we have it. Whiskey number 3, the Glenmorangie 14-year-old Quinta Ruban. So now it's time to taste the star of today's show, the newly released Glenmorangie 13-year-old cognac cask finish. Now again, there's an interesting history to this whiskey, but just before I launch into that, I will draw your attention to the fabulous packaging for this, and I really love the colour of the label. I think it stands out beautifully with that vibrant aquamarine blue in there. So, I've experimented over the years with many, many different cask types. And, not all of the experiments see the light of day as a bottled product. And I had dabbled a little bit with cognac casks very briefly, and almost flirtation for a full maturation of the spirit. But, I wasn't 100% happy with that for a variety of reasons. So I was very focused in developing this product. So again, I'm taking base Glenmorangie from X bourbon barrels after about 10 to 11 years old, and then I finished it in these French oak cognac casks, obviously from France. And the end result is this beautiful whiskey we're going to taste now. Now, French oak has a much higher level of tannin than American oak. So when you're using French oak, you can expect to get a little bit more, sometimes dryness, sometimes spiciness in there. So you need to be careful with them. So that's why I limited this to just under 3 years finishing, and I've released this small batch which we bottled back in May this year. And this truly is a one-off experiment. This is not to be repeated. So it's a lovely, deep, almost mahogany colour. And again, this has primarily come from the French oak, which also gives more colour to your whiskey. And on the nose, and again, I bottled this at 46%, it really has accentuated some of these lovely oaky flavours in there. There's a bit of clove, a bit of spice, a hint of toffee apple or something like that in there. And there's this lovely, warming, almost viscous, slightly vinous note coming through. So again, I'd like you to join me in opening up this whiskey. It's especially that toffee apple type sensation I'm getting. And on the nose now, there's maybe even a hint of leather. And we shouldn't be surprised about that because, again, higher levels of tannin give this sensation of lovely polished, burnished leather. A slight sensation of distant wood smoke. And a nice, fruity, perfumed top note. So again, it's similar. It's a Glenmorangie, but it is distinctively different from the rest of the whiskies in the range. So now, time to taste. And this is a big, bold flavoured whiskey. It explodes in the palate with all of these lovely spices, a slight grippiness from the tannin in the whiskey, but it's beautiful flavours of baked apples, baked pears, a hint of leather, some clove, a little bit of cinnamon in there, and it's a lovely, long but gentle, nutty aftertaste. And it's actually making me think of roasting chestnuts. And if you've ever been to Paris in the fall, the autumn time, and walked along the streets, you can often pass these braziers with roasting chestnuts on them. And that's what this is really reminding me of. It's a very surprising tasting whiskey. In fact, it's so surprising, I need to taste it for a second time. I'm now getting this almost cooling sensation in the mouth as I find a little bit more menthol and a little bit more eucalyptus in there. But again, the primary flavours, baked fruits, leather, clove, things like that. So ladies and gents, that is our latest release, the Glenmorangie 13-year-old cognac cask finish. Again, as with many Glenmorangies, it pairs beautifully with certain foods, and I really love this with an apple and pear tart, or maybe even a little bit of Stilton or other blue cheese, which will be strong enough to stand up to the intensity of flavour. And since we are now coming into that time of year where you maybe want something a little bit more warming, if you're going to use this in a cocktail, then I recommend an apple cider hot toddy made with Glenmorangie cognac finish. So ladies and gents, there it is, whiskey number 4 for today's tasting. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed me taking you through the range here, introducing you to some old favourites and to some new expressions of Glenmorangie. I certainly enjoyed describing them to you. But that's not all. We have a number of other new Glenmorangies I'd just like to briefly mention to you. Firstly, we have a limited edition pack of Glenmorangie 18-year-old, which we developed in collaboration with the Japanese floral artist Azumo Makoto. And Azumo's design was inspired by my description of the floral bouquet of Glenmorangie 18-year-old. And we also have A Tale of Winter, which is the successor to the fun product we had last year, A Tale of Cake. And as the name suggests, and the pattern of the woolly winter jumper, this is a perfect whiskey for enjoying on cold winter days. Both of these products are going to be with you in market before the end of 2021. One final thing I'd like to remind you of is that you can get access to the Glenmorangie Explorer pack, which is a taster pack with 4 small format bottles, one of Glenmorangie Original, one of Glenmorangie La Santa, one of Quinta Ruban, and one of Nectar d'Or. So that just about wraps it up. I'd just like to finish by thanking you all, ladies and gents, for taking the time to join me this afternoon and give me the opportunity to describe these whiskies to you. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the United States for helping make this happen. And finally, I'll just finish up by, on behalf of myself and all of the team at the Glenmorangie Company in Scotland, to say, Sláinte.